Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Mr. Thomas, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. Would you mind reintroducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Okay, my name is Donald Thomas, and I'm a government scientist, a career scientist, and I got an interest in the Kennedy assassination. So I published an article in a scientific journal called Science and Justice. It was a revisitation of the acoustical evidence, and later a book on the Kennedy assassination on the forensic evidence.
And the last time you were on this show was almost 2 years ago. We talked a lot about the acoustic evidence and kind of went into detail about how it was conducted and obviously some issues with the JFK community when it came to accepting the acoustic evidence. But I wanted to get your thoughts on eyewitness and ear witness testimony. We always hear things about you can't trust eyewitness testimony. And even Dealey Plaza being like an echo location or something where it sounds like shots were being bounced all over. What are your thoughts on trusting eyewitness testimony? Do you trust it the day of? Do you trust it later when, names come out like a year or two later? And it seems like sometimes with Howard Brennan, his memory got better as time went on. But do you trust it? And where do you go for your documentation when you're trying to look at a reliable source?
Yeah, so yeah, eyewitness testimony is generally considered to be the least reliable form of forensic evidence. Uh, the people don't have a tape recorder or a video recorder going on in their head, and your experience is going to be affected by your own life experience. If you look at for example, Abraham Zapruder was asked on the night that he turned over the Zapruder film, and he was asked where he thought the gunshots came from, and he said then what sounded like came from over behind me and to the right. And then 2 years later, when he was asked on TV on a CBS program, and they asked him, "Where do you think the gunshots came from?" He said, "Oh, it came from the book depository." So he completely, reversed his account on where he thought the shots came from. So yeah, if you want to, one general thing about eyewitness or witness testimonies, you want to get it close to the event as possible before it can be, because people will be influenced by what other people will say. If everybody around you is saying, well, the shots came from up there on the sixth floor of the book closet, you don't want to look stupid and say, well, I guess that's where I came from too. So yeah, there's a lot of problems with ear witness and eyewitness testimony. And if you look at the people who were in Dealey Plaza, and if you ask them where the shots came from, there was a pattern that the people on the eastern side of the book depository generally thought the shots came from the east side. People who are on the west side thought the shots came from the west side. So you part of the problem is if your distance from where the shooter is, if there's two shots and they're very close together, uh, and depending on your position, you may not differentiate the two different shots. Whereas if you're in a different position in the plaza, where you're further from one location, say from the book deposit or from the grassy knoll, now they can sound like two different shots. And so your position in the plaza there's a lot of influences on your eyewitness or ear witness testimony.
Now, when it comes to your opinion on where you think the shots came from, do you think the shots came from the school book depository?
Okay, so you're asking when I'm thinking, and so I have to answer the question with the word think in the.
If you want to say no, if you want, I just say that so you get less in trouble with people commenting some.
Okay, so I know what the acoustical evidence shows, and so the acoustical experts found 5 gunshots on the Dallas police tape. And so one of those, only one, was actually subjected to a deep sonar analysis to actually pinpoint where it came from. And that was the fourth shot. And that was pinpointed to uh, the grassy knoll, in fact, 8 feet from the corner of the fence. Now, the other 4 were never subjected to a complete sonar analysis. They matched to a test shot that was fired from the book depository better than the test shot from the grassy knoll. Now we know that they found 3 cartridge cases next to the window on the 6th floor of the book depository. So you would say those 4 shots, 3 of them probably came from the book depository, and that leaves you 1 from an unknown location. It had a better match to the book depository than from the grassy knoll. So that would suggest maybe from that east side of the plaza. Uh, and since Oswald's rifle could only be fired in 2 1/4 seconds, that is cycled, fired and refired. And if you take those, the 3 remaining shots, then the separation between them, between the first and second shot, was 1.1 seconds. So both of those shots could not have come from Oswald's rifle. The second and third were 1.6 seconds apart. And both of those couldn't come from Oswald's rifle. The only way it works would be the first and the third. And then since those could have come from the book depository, and then since the 4th shot came from the grassy knoll, then that leaves you with the 5th shot as being from the book depository. And so it's that second shot is the wild card, where we haven't really pinpointed where that shot might have come from.
Where many ear witnesses heard a boom and then a boom boom, which is sounds like 2 shots, kind of like less spaced apart than the other ones.
Yeah, some witnesses said they heard 3 shots, some heard 4 shots. I guess most of them thought they heard 3 shots back as their memory.
Now, with the acoustic evidence, do you believe that it was going into it with the mindset that Oswald did fire 3 shots, or at least 3 shots were fired from the school book depository, so that's why they were only examining the fourth?
Okay, so when BBN, Jim Barger is on record as saying that his assumption when they gave him the recording and their task was, number one, are the gunshots even on the recording? Number one. And number two, if they are, how many? Because the controversy at the time was that the official version was 3 shots, but then you had 4 wounds. So that would tend to suggest there were 4 shots. And that's why there was a controversy. So his assumption was, nah, it's probably not going to be gunshots here. But then when they checked on the recording and they actually found evidence, this is the analysis they did it back in their laboratory, where they simply ran the recording through a sonograph, and they found evidence for 5 shots. Now, at the time, they didn't know where they came from. They just reported back and said, hey, we know the official version says 3, but we found 5. If these are in fact gunshots, what we found is 5. So then they went to Dealey Plaza, and the question was, are these really gunshots? And the patterns that they had looked for, the expectation was that if you have a gunshot or a loud noise like a rifle shot in an urban environment, that's going to create an echo field. It'll resonate off the buildings. So what they're really looking for is echo field. All right. So basically, against it's going to look on a sonograph, and remember, you've got the motorcycle motor noises setting up the background. So what you're looking for in an echo field is, if I can give you an image, it's sort of like looking for a porcupine sitting on a fence. That's what you're
Just
looking
one
for.
giant spike up.
A visual. No, that's my point. You're not looking for a spike. You're looking for an echo field. So you're looking for a cluster of spikes, because the gunshot itself is going to be a spike, but then that could be, uh, just could be interference of some kind. You get a sunspot. You can just get a spike. It's just there's no such thing as a radio signal that doesn't have static noise. So what you're looking for is a cluster, a bunch of spikes, which would represent echoes off of the buildings. So that's why I'm saying you're not looking for one, you're looking for a bunch. So you're looking for a porcupine sitting on a fence. If you call those the quills, that's what you're looking for. And that's what they found. They found 5 porcupines sitting on the fence. then the question becomes, okay, how do we know that these aren't just false positives? How do we know these aren't just clusters? Maybe there's a short circuit in the radio of the motorcycle. It's causing every time he hits a stone, you get a cluster of spikes. So they went to Dealey Plaza the summer of 1978. They actually fired test shots from the book depository, from the grassy knoll. And so now they know exactly what an echo field in Dealey Plaza looks like, with the idea that the number of spikes, the number of echoes, and the spacing of the echoes will depend on the number and spacing of the buildings in Dealey Plaza. So now that they've got those test shots, now they know exactly what an echo field looks like, and they can compare those, the echo field on the police tape, to their test shots and see if they match. And in fact, all five of the test shots, all five of the suspects' patterns matched to one of the test shots they fired in Dealey Plaza. And as it happened, the fourth shot in of the five on the police tape matched to a test shot from the grassy knoll, much better than it did to the test shots from the book depository.
Now, would eyewitness testimony or ear witness testimony here support a lot of those acoustical analysis? Because if you look at the number of people that either heard 3 shots or heard 4 shots, then you would start looking at the people that were closest to the area you would suspect that shots came from.
Yeah, well, people are actually pretty good at determining the direction of a sound. That's why you have your ears on opposite sides of your head. And so it turns out of the witnesses in Dealey Plaza, there's been a couple of studies done on this. My favorite is the one that Tink Thompson published in his book, because he actually had a list of the witnesses and where they said that the gunshots came from. And I think that, as I recall, the numbers that he had was something like maybe a total of about 80 witnesses on his list, that he only included people whose testimony was actually recorded in the official in the Warren Commission's documents. And my memory is it came like 34 witnesses said shots came from the grassy knoll, and 26 said it came from the book depository. And I think there was 4 that they thought it came from both directions. And then I think there were two witnesses that said it came from left field, post office or whatever. So you're always going to have left fielders.
What about people that were in the Texas School Book Depository that didn't hear any shots at all? Obviously, everyone is at the same event and everyone's probably perceiving things a little bit differently, but we have such wide range of what everyone's perceiving where I'm like, is everyone like in their own multiverse where they're seeing different things happen at multiple times? Because I have a statement from one woman on the 3rd floor that heard no shots. But I also look at statements that, in my belief, they were altered. I don't necessarily think it's grand conspiracy style, but there's a statement from one of the women that were working on the 3rd floor, and she talked about that she didn't hear any shots and she was nearsighted, and she doesn't even recall if she saw President Kennedy's car at all. And she said that the 25th of November, 1963. Well, if you look at her March 13th or March 14th statement in 1964, that I didn't know if I saw the president's car turned into, then I saw the president's car turn onto Elm Street. And it's like, well, how did she get so certain over a year worth of time?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Your memory tends to gel over time. Like I say, you're influenced. And this is why, well, there's an old lawyer saying that nothing will influence a jury more than the testimony of an eyewitness, and nothing will confuse a jury more than the testimony of 2 eyewitnesses. So, because you've always got, because of these multiple influences, and aside from the fact you're always going to have left fielders, I think one of the most interesting eyewitness in that regard was Junior Jarman, who was on the 5th floor, right underneath where the gunshots were fired. And his testimony was that the very first shot, well, first of all, he said the gunshots, he said he felt it more than he actually heard it, because everything shook, the building shook, and dust came down from the ceiling. And he said, but the first shot he heard sounded like it came down on the street. it was the second shot that really reverberated and that he felt. So where did he hear that first shot come from? So and in fact, apart from those 5 gunshots, there was another sound. It was 2 seconds before the first gunshot sound, there was a sharp sound, but it did not have a full set of echoes. So that suggests it could have been a sound that could have been a backfire, or it could have been a firecracker, or it could have been nothing. It could have been a static burst. But there is in fact a sound that preceded the sounds identified as gunshots. And so maybe because I'm sure if you look into the eyewitnesses, a lot of them will say things like, well, the first sound I heard startled me,
Yeah.
and I thought it was a backfire, and I realized, and everybody laughed, because it had startled them. So there may well have been a sound that was like a backfire of a motorcycle, maybe. That's another thing. Witnesses said those darn motorcycles are backfiring all the time. Jackie said it seemed like the motorcycles are always backfiring.
Well, the very first shot, everyone has come to an agreement, if unless you're looking at Dallas police, that it sounded like a firecracker. Like
Right. A lot of people
distinctly,
reported that.
everyone, as far as I can see, a lot of people reported that it was a firecracker. Where I go, could it have been possible that one could have been lit off and people were just distracted, and then they heard a second and third, which was really the first and second? Does that make sense?
It could. You bet. There's ways that you can explain it. And in fact, a little known background on this is at one point they found a pistol in Dealey Plaza. And so when the acoustical experts did their test in Dealey Plaza, they included a pistol shot because they were thinking that uh, uh, one of the things that could have happened, just thinking what's possible, was that maybe somebody with a starter pistol. Because if you've got a triangulation of fire and you've got with the idea that you'll confuse witnesses as to just as cover fire. Like maybe one guy is the designated hitter and the other people are just firing gunshots, and that will confuse people as to where the real shooter is. Uh, then the question is, well, how do they know when to start? When is Kennedy in the kill zone so that the real assassins can coordinate their fire? And so there was this crazy idea. Maybe there's a starter pistol. Maybe somebody used that as the first shot. So they included, they fired a pistol as part of their test, and then compared that pistol shot to the suspect sounds, and it didn't match anything. So
Now, when it comes to the echo and bouncing off buildings, is that just because of obviously the template or the plaza layout? There are a lot of things are kind of symmetrical, like the South Knoll. I think a lot of people bring up it could have been shots from the South Knoll. I don't necessarily haven't looked into the whole South Knoll, but apparently everything was so in match and symmetrical to each other that's why they were talking about echo. And I know that gets brought up as a point that kind of cancels out the acoustics, but I think if you look into the acoustic, it kind of defines it a little bit more, where it's like it's using more science to determine the shots than just saying, I think they'll be able to rule out echo is what I'm saying.
yeah, well, a rifle shot's going to cause echoes in the plaza, and not just off the buildings. The echoes are going to come off the ground. They're going to come off the cars. They're going to come off telephone poles. There'll be echoes. It's just that the larger the structure, the larger and stronger the echo will be. And so the original analysis, when I'm saying we're looking for that porcupine, we're
Yeah.
looking at those. They only looked at the top 10 echoes because you've got the problem that the motorcycle noise, the piston firings are going to swamp out most of your smaller echoes. And so remember, what they did was they actually had 36 different microphone locations, because one thing for sure is it's on the tape recording, and the police recording is on a motorcycle that's somewhere in Dallas. So they figured, okay, if it's in Dealey Plaza, is one of the 18 motorcycles with the motorcade, then it's going to be either on Houston Street or it's going to be on Elm Street. So they set up 36 microphones locations. And so they actually had, for every test shot, they had 36 templates to compare. And then they had, of course, because you got from the book depository and the grassy knoll, so now you've got 72 templates that you can compare to those 5 test shots. So yeah, they're basically covering their bases. And you could argue that, well, if a shot came from the South Knoll or if it came from the post office, whichever side, wherever it might have come from, you would need to do that sonar, go into the deep sonar analysis in order to pinpoint exactly. It's triangulation with each one of those echo surfaces as being one point, the shooter 1 point, and the microphone being the other point. The only one that they actually did that analysis to was the fourth shot.
Now, how would you compare the importance of the acoustic evidence compared to the importance of the Zapruder film? It's always kind of boggled my mind how we base so much of how the shots were fired or the trajectory on the basis of a silent film, where you're just guessing off the reactions of Connolly and JFK.
Right, exactly. And so that's why you need both. Yeah. So, uh, and that's how science works is you look for convergence from different lines of evidence. And so, yeah, the Zapruder film, it can be deceptive. One of the most deceptive is when you see Kennedy react. What exactly, when Kennedy went into his flinch, his first, they said it was reacting to a severe external stimulus rather than just say, when they did the photogrammetric analysis of what he was reacting to. And then even the Warren Commission was claiming that Connolly's reaction could have been a delayed a delayed reaction. So that's where uh, yeah, there's no such thing as 100% in science. So that's why you need to look at separate lines of evidence to see where they converge.
Did you have any thoughts on the Zapruder film? Obviously, when it comes to historical importance, it's a significant film, but I wouldn't consider it something that we should be basing, obviously, any evidence on. I mean, you can look at the reactions. I think it's interesting to watch, but I think with the community and with new researchers, it just tends to cause more confusion than it does actually reveal answers.
Well, you have to. I don't see how you can exclude it. I don't know how you could possibly say let's do it all without the Zapruder film. Ignore the Zapruder film. No, it's part of the evidence, and obviously interpretations can be different. There have been several different, for example, the blur analysis that was done on the Zapruder film, and every one, I think there was 5 different blur analyses, and each one of them comes out a little bit different. So, yeah, you have to take. That's true of any form of evidence. That's why we say there's no such thing as 100% in science, but you don't want to exclude any evidence either.
Well, if you're saying how could you not exclude or how could you exclude the Zapruder film? I mean, can you determine if that part where Kennedy grabs his throat, could you tell if that was a shot or not?
Okay, so Kennedy didn't actually grab at his throat, did he?
I went up
So
like
that was
this.
the Warren Commission. Yeah, he actually comes up to his chin. His hands come up to his chin. So it looks like he's actually going into a flinch. And the other thing is he couldn't have if he'd been shot through the throat, shot through the neck, which we know actually the bullet obliterated the lateral spur of the seventh vertebral bone that would have caused flaccid paralysis. He couldn't have moved his arms. He couldn't have done that if he'd have been. Again, I can't say it's 100% because you never say 100%, but the expectation is if that bullet had gone at the point at which the bullet goes through his neck, he should have gone into flaccid paralysis instantly. So that strongly suggests he has not been shot through the neck when he made his move. He jerked forward, shook his head, brought his arm. Well, this arm was already up. He was waving. This arm came up, so he goes like this. So he's not really clutching at his throat. Probably has not been shot through the neck at that point.
But you believe that he was shot in the neck.
Oh, absolutely, he was shot
Okay,
through the
because
neck.
about to say the doctors at Parkland talked about how they put a trach tube in because there was already a
Right,
pre-existing
already
hole
a
that was
bullet hole
there.
there.
Yeah.
That's right, and there was a bullet hole in his back, and they lined up. So he was shot through the neck. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, I believe it was a. I think they even talked about that it wasn't a full through and through hole in his neck.
So yeah, they never, that was one of the flaws of the autopsy, that a forensic autopsy would have dissected the wounds to establish whether or not they connected. And of course, one of the autopsy doctors later said, well, they were ordered not to do it. So this is the result, and this is why you have the controversy. And so many people will still believe he was shot from the front into the throat versus he was shot in the back and it came out his throat. Had they actually dissected the wound, which a forensic pathologist would have done, then we would not have had this controversy all these years.
Well, where do you think on his back he was shot at?
Well, yeah, he was shot through this. It went through it was the upper back. It went through struck at the seventh cervical vertebrae.
Because the Warren Commission moved, Gerald Ford moved that wound up 6 inches in a
Right.
report to match
Yeah.
the back of his
Gerald
neck.
Ford told him change it because the original report said it was in the back. And in fact, if you look at his jacket, you can see in the back the
Yeah.
hole in the jacket is about 6 inches below the collar. So yeah, from the back. If you look the way a person's sitting on the side, their throat is lower. It's about equal to their upper back. So it's not a contradiction to say back or neck. It went in the back and came out near the Adam's apple.
Now, have you tried to figure out if you can match up the audio analysis to the Zapruder film and that the reactions matched when the shots were fired?
Yes, yes, and in fact they do. And again, that's separate lines of evidence converging because there's two places in the film that you can actually pinpoint where the wound is inflicted. And one, obviously, as you see Kennedy's head burst at frame 313. And then if you look at Conley, where Conley contorts and then he falls over, and just before he does that, he's holding on to his Stetson hat and he flips the hat flips up. He was struck in the wrist, broke his radial bone, and then you see his jacket flap out, and that's at frame 224. So the separation between frame 224 and frame 313 is exactly 4.8 seconds on the Zapruder film. And then if you go to the acoustical evidence, the separation between the third shot and the fourth shot is also 4.8 seconds. So the Zapruder film lines up with the acoustical evidence. And of course, the fourth shot came from the grassy knoll. And so that explains why Kennedy's head snapped backwards when he was hit.
Now, the magic bullet theory or the single bullet theory. Obviously, do you use Connolly's statement at all when it comes to him addressing that he was not hit by the same bullet that hit Kennedy?
Right. Yeah. In fact, he said he never heard it. And in fact, and so you probably wouldn't hear the bullet that actually hits you. It's going to hit you before the sound gets to you. So yeah, as far as Connolly's reaction, it's not surprising. He said he heard, because he said, I heard a shot before I was hit. And he said, and I wouldn't have heard the shot that hit me. So there was definitely a shot before. And the acoustical evidence actually shows two shots before he was hit.
Now, sticking along the lines of obviously witness statements, but I would have to ask about how much you respect H.B. McLean's statement when it came to obviously he's the motorcycle cop that had his recorder stuck on. And I don't know if he did give a testimony, I think, to the Warren Commission. No, it's the HSCA. Yeah, in the 70s. And he had a different opinion than I thought he would for a Dallas police officer.
Yeah. Also, yes, he was interviewed by the House Select Committee, kind of cold. He didn't know what they were going to ask him about. And then, of course, later he's talked to people. He's talked to me. I've met McLean. I've talked to McLean because McLean comes to the Dallas meetings because he's curious. He wants to know, was it my motorcycle that captured the gunshot?
Wait, is he still alive?
I don't think he's still alive. When I met him was back in the 90s. It's been a long time since I've talked to McLean. Uh, yeah, I yeah, I'm pretty sure he's probably passed, but I don't know that for sure. Anyhow, so McLean, that's very interesting. McLean had a couple of different things to say in his memory. First of all, one of the controversies about it is he did say, yeah, he had a problem with his microphone sticking open. Yeah. And he said, yeah, he believed he was tuned to channel one, but he wasn't sure. And yeah, the recording of the gunfire is on channel one over. And it turns out we do know from all the films, we can say for positive now. I've heard other people say different things. If it was not McLean, that's not there. McLean is the only motorcycle of the 18 that's in the right place at the right time, who could be at the right place at the right time. Because in the films, we see McLean on Houston Street, and then before the gunfire, and we see him on Elm Street after the gunfire. He's the only motorcycle that could have been at the right place at the right time. Now, McLean did say a couple of things. He said that he was on Houston Street when he heard the first shot. Okay, check that agrees with the acoustical evidence. He says that he stopped on Houston Street, and he's not the only cop who said that they thought traffic came to a stop on Houston Street. And we can't prove otherwise because there is no film. There's a gap in the films. Going back and look at, you see the film that was in the Hughes film that shows McLean turning off of Main Street onto Houston Street. And then later there's other films, but there's no films that really show the movement of the cars as they move from the back in the motorcade where McLean was. To say for certain that they didn't stop, they might have stopped. He might have stopped. The contradiction, though, is he says that he stopped on. He also said he saw Mrs. Kennedy on the trunk of the car. And he says also that he thought he saw Mrs. Kennedy on the trunk of the car when he stopped on Houston Street. Okay. Well, we can prove that didn't happen. That we can prove because Mrs. Kennedy in the Zapruder film jumped out onto the trunk of the car at about 3 seconds after the headshot. She climbed onto the trunk, grabbed something, which later turns out the piece of the Kennedy's head, and then she climbed back into the car. So she was only out there for about 3 seconds. It was from about 3 to 6 seconds after the shooting, that after the headshot, that she was out onto the trunk of the car. So there's a film that was taken by a lady named Elsie Dorman, who was on the second floor of the book depository. In one of the segments of her film, and again, it's an amateur film, and you wish that she had taken a continuous film.
Yeah, she stopped after it turned on Elm Street.
She would film and she'd stop and she'd film and she'd stop, and she's actually 4 different segments of the film. In one of those films, the fourth segment, it begins and you see the mayor's car is directly underneath the street light. And then she pans back and you see a cop arrive at the intersection. So this is known as the cop in Dorman. So the cop in Dorman can only be either Corson or it's McLean. And if it is, and it turns out that the Dorman film can be matched to a film that was taken by one of the photographers who was in the motorcade. And his film shows events. And one of the events in that film is the mayor's car directly underneath the streetlight. Okay. And that film can be matched to events in the Zapruder film. And so that's how we know that the cop in Dorman is there at 6 seconds after the headshot because of that timing. So now it boils down to, is that McLean or is it Corson? And if it is McLean, then we can say definitively, you're in the wrong place. If that's McLean, you have just invalidated the acoustical evidence. That's McLean. He's in the wrong place. But if it's Corson, then McLean has to be in front of him, and the acoustical evidence places him ahead of the mayor's car. And so it very much supports the acoustical evidence if that is Corson. So the trouble is, Corson also said that he saw Mrs. Kennedy on the trunk of the car. In fact, Corson's account is that when he arrived at the intersection, he looked down the street, saw Mrs. Kennedy on the trunk of the car. So the Dorman film fits that as Corson, that his testimony exactly matches it. On the other hand, if that's McLean, well, McLean did not stop and see Mrs. Kennedy when he was back on Houston Street. Because, in fact, I've gone out because of that. I've gone out and stood there on Houston Street, and you cannot see down. Because remember, there's a 3% grade that goes down to where the car would have been at the time when Mrs. Kennedy was on the trunk of the car. You couldn't have seen it. Well, we know from this film that that didn't happen anyway, because if that's either McLean or Corson, then either way, you'd have to be on Elm Street to see Mrs. Kennedy. And it fits both. If that's McLean, I'm sorry, if that's Corson, McLean is ahead of him, and both men could have seen Mrs. Kennedy on the trunk of the car. So as far as McLean's account, his eyewitness account, the one thing he is wrong about is that those two things couldn't have coincided. Did not, because we know that from the Dorman film.
Now, you obviously go in a little bit into kind of debunking a little bit some of the myths, I would say, of the Warren Commission. Um, Obviously, a lot of people, I think, now with time have become very critical of some of the actions of the Warren Commission, just certain areas they didn't go into. But McLean obviously stated in his HSCA interview when he was asked about if he believed conspiracy, kind of took him off guard for a second. But he stated that they investigated what they already knew, and that's how it came out. Like he says statements like that, and where you start going, "Do you believe conspiracy?" And he says, "Yeah, I just don't. I just think all the evidence that they were looking for, or what they were making, that's how the conclusion was going to be." So that changes your perspective on things when you're looking at a government investigation into this.
Oh yeah, yeah, and the cops had again. There's many cops. There's probably as many different theories, but a lot of them. One of the worst was the case where the with the fellow who's it
Seizure victim?
no, oh,
Oh,
it's a whole different part.
that's Belknap, Jerry Belknap.
The star witness for the Warren Commission was one of the one of the black employees who supposedly went up to the sixth floor, and he's the only witness that could place Oswald on the sixth floor at the time during the lunch hour.
It's not Brennan, but who is? Oh man, I just did a
Yeah,
clip on this guy.
his name will come to me eventually. Too late.
That's how it works too.
You're right. Yeah. Well, there you go. Eyewitness testimony. So yeah. Anyway, but that he had, when he testified to the Warren Commission in March, he said that he went up to the sixth floor to get his cigarettes, and that when he went up there, he saw Oswald, and that uh, in that Warren Commission, they when they asked him, well, what time was that? And he said, oh, that must have been right about noon because, and then they kind of cut him off as to why he thought it was. And actually, then it turns out that was in March, but back in November, he had been picked up by APB. He was one of the guys that left the building, and one of the couple of one of the cops said that they picked him up because he had seen they had been told that he had seen the assassin, and so they went and picked him up. And when they brought him into the police station, the police one of the policemen, police lieutenant said, yeah, he said that he was at the window and he saw the assassin. Well, how could that be? If it was Oswald, he would have been the star witness and said, yeah, Oswald was the assassin. And then it turns out the FBI interviewed him and that same day. And when the FBI interviewed him, he said, they asked him, did you see Lee Oswald? And he goes, yeah, I saw him. He was in the lunchroom eating lunch by himself. So he went from being an eyewitness that fit Oswald's alibi in November, and 4 months later, when he testifies to the Warren Commission, he becomes the star witness against him. And the problem is that the cops were saying things like, "This Warren Commission's a waste of time because we got this witness who was right there in the window and he saw the shooter, he saw the assassin. So why is the Warren Commission even doing this?" So the cops were, yeah, the cops are all over the map.
Why do you think the Warren Commission took testimony from people that obviously they could be fact checked later with film and documentation to prove that they weren't where they, like Howard Brennan? Dude said he was in a spot that he wasn't in that spot at all, and then he changed his statement probably 6 or 7 different times every time he gave a statement, to the point where when he was invited into a lineup, he couldn't even pick Oswald up out of a lineup, and they're just like, "Hey, it's okay. We're gonna forget about this. Just go back home."
Well, okay, so Brennan, I mean, you can see Brennan. He's wearing that the hat. He's got a hard hat. You can see him sitting on the fence on the wall around the reflecting pond. And when he actually, when he, I thought he was quite honest because when he testified to the Warren Commission, they confronted him like he was a liar, and they said, "Okay, when you went to the lineup, you told the Dallas police that Oswald was the guy you saw shoot Kennedy, but then when you talked to the FBI, you told the FBI you didn't identify him. So were you lying then? Or were you lying now?" Kind of a thing. And Brennan goes, "No, I didn't tell him that." He says, "I didn't tell the cops that." He said, "I did." He said, "I saw Lee Harvey Oswald on television that afternoon. They brought him out on TV." And so he said, "When I went to the lineup, in my own mind, he said, I couldn't decide if I says, I recognize Oswald, but did I recognize him because I saw him on TV, or did I recognize him because I saw him in the window?" And he said, "I decided that then I shouldn't be a witness against him." He said, "I told the cops and the FBI that I could not make a positive ID." Of course, that's not what the Warren Commission says. The Warren report, they flat asked him, "Well, do you think it was the guy that you saw? Do you think Oswald was the guy you saw?" He says, "Yeah, I think it was." Good enough.
Do you
Close
look
enough.
when you look at evidence from witnesses or testimony from witnesses, were you surprised at the number of people that did not recall knowing Oswald or ever associating with him or ever seeing him in that building, either the day of or at all?
No, because most of the people worked on, most of those secretaries and people worked on the second floor because they were the booksellers. Oswald hadn't been there that long, for one thing, and he worked mainly on the first floor, with the book bins, and then he would go up to the sixth, fifth floors, seven floors, whatever, where they had the dead storage to retrieve books. And he didn't eat lunch with the others. So remember, Book Depository had two lunchrooms because this is 1963 Southern United States. They had one they had the nice lunchroom, which was the white people's lunchroom, and then on the first floor they had what they call the domino room, and that's where the black employees. There were four black employees, and they all ate their lunch down on the first floor. And they said Oswald typically ate his lunch with them.
There's Eddie Piper's testimony. I'm going to bring this up because if you look at the number of employees that worked for the TSPD that were black, you have to start wondering why a lot of people did not want to associate with being known for whoever knowing Oswald, because Oswald's being labeled as a cop killer at this point. He was only being arraigned for the murder of Tippit. Um, so a lot of the questioning was focused on that. But Eddie Piper was on the first floor. He's a janitor. He talked about seeing Oswald at noon.
And spoke to it.
And spoke to him and talked to him, and Oswald said he was going to go up and eat his lunch. Now, at the time, Eddie Piper had a $200 DUI charge. So later, his statement changes from "I never saw Oswald and never spoke to him. I didn't even see him in the building past the morning." So there's a weird thing where you start going, you stated that you spoke to the man. He said this sentence to you. And now you're saying that something changed, where I have to go, you're being questioned either by Dallas police or federal law enforcers, and you're in a certain area of Dallas that you can call racist if you want, but there's got to be some influence in your testimony.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's the way people are. And one of the person in that regard was the secretary who said she walked out the front door and she turned and looked through the glass door and saw Oswald standing there at lunchtime between 12:15 and 12:30. And of course, when she told that to the FBI, they're going, "Well, are you sure that was Oswald?" And, "Well, I'm pretty sure." Well, that's the question, exactly that question you would ask. If the Warren Commission had been serious, they'd have brought her in, and they never did because they knew what she was saying. They didn't want to put this on the record. You'd have asked, "Well, how well did you know this guy? What is your certainty based on? Could it have been a different time, a different day, a different person? Why would there be any doubt? In other words, that you saw Oswald, and that's the kind of questions a real investigation would have asked.
The real reason I've been asking people, every researcher so far, about the eyewitness and ear witness testimony is because you could tell a lot by where they started to focus with and what they decided to trust. I don't believe a lot of the documentation that comes out of the government, even though I do use it as a basis. I think we all just have this thing instilled inside of us where it's like the government would have a good say so. You don't really question, much like nobody questioned the Warren Commission because you got all these star cast on there. But if you really examine some of the statements and things that were left out, we never had an investigation that solely focused on the witnesses, which I thought would have been more beneficial, especially when we talk about the trusting of eyewitness and ear witness testimony. I think in this, you have to kind of hold that higher than a lot of the documentation and a lot of the trajectory stuff. Not saying that it's all junk. I'm just saying that there's a lot of stuff, like even with the HSCA, I think it comes from Tim Smith. He told me when he spoke with Bob Blakey, Blakey had regrets, not just about like when I spoke with him and he regretted the CIA withholding information, but putting Jack White on the stand because Jack White didn't know what the hell he was talking about. There was a lot of things that in the moment and with hindsight, there's a lot of changes to it. But what do you think about an investigation that would be solely focused on the witnesses at the time, that just examined every single person, tried to find and track every single person's testimony, even the people that came out later, whether it was fear?
Oh yeah, oh for sure. No, I'm for all all evidence, even if it's not as we you take it with a grain of salt. You just recognize that okay, there that people will say different things at different times because they're influenced for whatever. But you definitely want to hear as much of that testimony, and I'm sure the Warren Commission tailored. I'll bet allows people who told them that yeah, that gunshot came from the grassy knoll. Those people never got recorded, and we know that the Warren Commission edited that some of the documents to cut out things that were embarrassing to the government. Uh, but yeah, so like you say, 600 witnesses. That's the first time I heard that number. I've heard estimates of about 400 people.
That's the Warren Commission's number. Then the HSCA went a little bit lower.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, that would and yet in the Warren Commission, you go through all their documents, you only find about 80 people that were actually asked who were in Dealey Plaza. What did you think of where the shots or what they could have heard? And now we know there were a lot of people with cameras.
The president's coming to town. Of course, there people are going to have their cameras out.
We've never seen what that kind of evidence could show us. So yeah, there's it had been a thorough. And on the Warren commissioners themselves, remember, two of them publicly renounced it when it came out. It became clear that the Warren report had was a pack of lies, to put it one way. And then one of the other the guy from Georgia, the congressman from Georgia, he told his staff that he never went public with it, but he told his staff that he no longer could vouch for the Warren
Well,
report. So that's half of them right there.
every Warren Commission member at the end, or either privately or publicly, had said something different about the Warren Commission's findings. Even John McCloy, who was a staunch supporter of the Warren Commission findings and agreed with Gerald Ford, but he stated privately he didn't buy that Connolly was hit by the same bullet that Kennedy was hit
There you
with.
go. Yeah, the single bullet theory was one of the main reasons why they all eventually said they didn't believe it.
The only one I felt super bad for besides Hale Boggs was Richard Russell
Dale
because
Boggs, yeah.
yes, what is it? Johnson on that famous phone call you can look up when Richard Russell's like, I don't want to serve. And Johnson's like, well, you're going to goddamn serve. Like he's just forcing him into it, strong arm him. Like, that's rough. You don't want to hear that from the people that are investigating the president. But when we talk about researchers' work, this is kind of leading into the big question here. Do you trust? Obviously, Mark Lane had some issues, but there are interviews and things that were done by authors. And still, look, Larry Sneed did great work, I'm sure, with a lot of witnesses and getting stuff. But I still need a government document or an investigative purpose for that. It's hard for me to accept an author's work at face value over, a commission or an investigative arm of the
Citizen
government.
researchers, yeah. If the government's not going to do it, That's why you wind up with the citizen researchers. It would be great if the government would, and there is a movement. There's some of the fellows that are trying to get the government to reopen the case officially. I'm telling them not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. But
Do you find yourself getting more, I wouldn't say misanthropic about it, but do you find yourself getting more kind of like, we're never going to get answers? This is probably as far as we're going to end up getting, maybe get a couple details, but you're never going to get a final conclusion. Because I'm wondering for my generation, I mean, obviously, maybe I don't think we'll get answers in my time, but I think for a lot of people that have waited so long, and we know Cyril Wecht just passed away recently, and a lot of researchers that have been waiting years for answers, deserve answers, might not be getting those answers.
we'll never know everything. Even if there is a complete reopen investigation, we'll never know everything. A lot too many people have died. Uh, but I think the basic outline of what happened is knowable, and I think we've actually know enough to know basically what happened. We're not going to be 100% certainty. Yeah, I don't know if we're 100% certainty about anything. So
And when it comes to the newer generations picking up the mantle, I mean, do you have hope that people will get interested in it, or are you just noticing that it's like the same loop in all the communities and stuff like that? Like I
oh
found,
no, no,
okay,
it's essential that new eyes and new blood because guys like me, we're set in stone. We know what we know. Okay, and that's how paradigm shifts have happened. Paradigm shifts don't happen because old guys like me or Mark Lane, I guess he's gone now. Of course, Cyril's gone. Josiah Thompson, us old guys, uh, paradigm shifts don't happen because we go, oh, we were wrong the whole time. Yeah, I realize now Oswald did it. Yeah, no, that's why you need people, young people who are not committed to any particular story and are completely open minded to go back and look at the evidence. There's so much more evidence available now than there was in the Warren Commission time or during the House Select Committee's time. Now you can go back and look at all the evidence that's accumulated over the last 40 years. Take a look at all of that evidence with a complete unbiased opinion. That's where the paradigm shifts come from. And that's true in science. That's where scientists insist that we're completely objective and scientists do not change their mind. That's just a human trait. So it is essential to in the end to have young people who can look at this with an unjaundiced eye and without a formed opinion and look at all the evidence and come up with a cogent answer.
have you felt that since when you first started doing this, compared to where you are now, that you've shifted any opinions on who did it, or any opinions of where you've leaned towards more acceptance of a different thought or theory?
Yeah, I've shifted because for the longest time I felt like something's missing here. This isn't making sense. All of these different lines of evidence are pointing different ways. And eventually I've come to accept that it was a convergence. The only thing that makes sense to me is that was a convergence from two different groups that came together. And that's where I'm at now. And heck, that could change as we get some more evidence. So that's where I'm at now. So my thinking has shifted in that way because I begin to think that it wasn't just one group. It wasn't just the CIA. It was because there's too much evidence of cops being involved, and that's where I've come to. You've got two different forces that eventually came together.
And how difficult is it for you to understand that the historical record is probably lost right now, at least when it comes to people that should have investigated something and they didn't do it? And there's a lot of pieces and answers we're just never going to have.
Yeah, that's doing history. And so yeah, it'd be great with 2020 hindsight. If I could go back in time, I'd stand there behind the grassy knoll.
I would stand on the sixth floors to check. If
Yeah,
Oswald walks up, I would be
there
like,
you
"Hey, man,
go.
go back
There you go.
downstairs,
Yeah,
dude. Not
yeah,
today."
yeah.
It would be really upsetting if it turns out it was Woody Harrelson's dad. I would be, damn, we
That's
chalked that
right.
off
Yeah,
to nothing.
yeah,
We
that's right.
didn't.
That would upset me. Yeah. Same thing. I did a Bob Groden and I many years ago. The Japanese had us come to Houston. This is where one of the prisoners, the guy claimed that he had
James
shot Kennedy
Files.
using a pistol, high-powered pistol, and so we went there and testified. If it turns out that guy was right, then I'll probably slit my wrist.
Mr. Thomas, I appreciate the work you have done for the community. I appreciate the work that you've done in the case and for generations like myself that are going to kind of come at this with the 2020 hindsight. Um, but is there a place where people can find any of your links?
No, you go on Google. I know I've been filmed a number of times at some of the meetings. ITC-SPAN did one or two. You can find my lectures. I know I've given 3 lectures at the Pittsburgh the Wecht Institute, and all those are available. And some of the but I've never I've never looked up or collected any of those. So you can find the article I wrote in Science and Justice on Google. It looks like my book is back on sale again for a while, a number of years it was out of print. And then just recently, I mean, you could get on eBay copies of it or whatever, but now they seem to be selling that book's on sale again at Amazon. So, and buy it because all the profits go to the Mary Farrell Foundation. So, yeah.
I'll make sure I'm gonna link any links I can find for you in the description. I appreciate the time, Mr. Thomas. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.